Today, Tu BeAv, before going into the reasons why it's a Yom Tov, it's important to note, we daven Shachris already, the Shulchan Aruch, in Hilchas Tachnun, Sin Kuf Lamed Aleph, Si Vav, the Shulchan Aruch says you do not say Tachnun today, and the Mishnah Berurah adds on, not only the day of Tu BeAv you don't say Tachnun, but you actually don't say Tachnun the Mincha before. In Siman Tov Kuf Ayin Gimel, speaking about the days of fast and the days that you don't fast, the Mishnah Berurah brings in Sifkat and Zayin that a chassan that's going to be getting married tonight does not fast. However, Lam Natseach, between Ashri and Avol Tzin, Lam Natseach you do say. He's a Mokum, people made a mistake that you don't even say Lam Natseach, but it's a Yom Tov, you don't say Tachnun. Why don't you say Tachnun today? Rosh Chodesh we know, Chanukah, Purim we know, Tisha B'Av that we just passed, Ikri Moyed, we understand. What's the pshat? So the Goyin over the Shulchan Aruch says the Mekoyer is the Gemara in Tainus. It's a Mishnah. The Mishnah in the fourth Perek Daf Chavav and Beis. The Mishnah says, Amar Reb Shimon ben Gamliel Hoyu Yom Tovim Li Yisrael Kechamisha Asa BeAv Yom Kippur. In other words, the Mishnah says that Tu BeAv today is a Yom Tov. It's a Yom Tov, and being that's a Yom Tov, you don't say Tachnun on Yom Tov. What exactly is the Yom Tov today? At kedei kach that the Mishnah says, Reb Shimon Gamliel lo hoyu Yom Tovim BeYisrael. There was no Yom Tov like the Yom Tov of Tu BeAv and Yom Kippur. So the Gemara Daf Lamed Amud Beis Daf Lamed Aleph Amud Aleph, the Gemara gives 6 reasons. We're not going to go through all the 6 reasons. About half of them we'll go through. The first reason, the Gemara says, you know why Tu BeAv? Tu BeAv is the day Shehutru the Shvatim Lovei Zeh B'Zeh, meaning to say, if there were only girls, they yarshin their father, if they're going to marry out of their shevet, the nachla is going to go out from them, it's going to go out into a different shevet. So on Tu BeAv, these girls that yarshin their fathers nechasim, they were allowed to marry to a different shevet. That's what the Gemara says. First reason. Amar Rav Yehuda Mashmul Yom Shehutru Shvatim Lovei Zeh B'Zeh. And the Gemara brings a drasha. My dorish ze adava shatzivel of Bnei Slavcha. They were only daughters. They yarshin their father, and if they would have married out of the shevet, the nachla would go to a different shevet, and now it became mutter. Like Rashi says, v'hitiru, the heter came on Tu BeAv. The Sfas Emes asks, what does it mean the heter came on Tu BeAv? That's when the heter came. If anything, the drasha was, if you take a look at the drasha is that only this door was not allowed to marry into a different shevet. So the heter came now. If anything, the opposite. It was always mutter, and there's only an issa for this door. So what does it mean? The heter came. So he says, b'doimit you find other things that, let's say, Chazal added, different things that were added, and Kaviyachol HaKadosh Baruch Hu was moida. He agreed to it. The same thing over here also. Really, it was an issa throughout. It's true with the drasha, it sounds that it was only Asr that door, but really it was always Asr. And Chazal, the Chacham and Moshe Rabbeinu, they were matter then, but often that it was only Asr that door. How do you understand that it's a Yom Tov? What's the understanding of the Yom Tov that they were able to marry into another shevet? So the Bnei Yissaschar explains, and he says the following: in Megillas Tainus we find the Gemara on Shabbos brings it that Chanukah kavam b'halol v'haidah. We made it as a Yom Tov b'halol v'haidah. It's a Yom Tov. With what is it a Yom Tov? There's no Issa Malacha. You're allowed to work on Chanukah. What is the Yom Tov? The Yom Tov is Bahal Vayda. Meaning to say, explains the Bnei Yissaschar, what makes it into a Yom Tov. Yom Tov means Yom Tov, a good day, a day Yom that is connected to Tov. What does Halal V'Haidah have to do with Tov? So he brings a few psukim. Tov L'Haidah L'Hashem. Tov L'Haidah L'Hashem. Haidah to the Hashem is Tov. So Haidah is connected to Tov. Haidu L'Hashem Ki Tov, it's Haidah. We say every day in Shemoneh Esrei, Ha Tov Shemcha U'Lecha Noah L'Haidah. So it's Tov. So that we understand it's Tov. And with that he explains, the Gemara says, with what is Tu BeAv called the Yom Tov? Bishleima Yom Kippur is a Yom Tov, and even Yom Kippur, the Gemara doesn't say Yom Kippur is a Yom Tov because of Isser Malacha. Why not? That's also a Yom Tov. But because the Mishnah says there was no Yom Tovim like Yom Kippur, Tu BeAv and Yom Kippur. Every Yom Tov, Sukkot, Pesach, there's also a Isser Malacha. So what is the Yom Tov? The Gemara says, you know why Yom Kippur is a Yom Tov? First of all, it's a Slicha u'Mechila. We have Kapara on Yom Kippur. Ki ata Hashem Tov v'Salach. So Slicha is Tov, it's good. And Yom Shenitna B'Lucha Shniyos, the Torah, which also is Tov, L'man Yitav Lach. So that we understand, Yom Kippur is a day of Tov. But the Gemara says, why is Tu BeAv Tov, a Yom Tov, a Yom Tov? What's the Tov? So that the teretz is that they were able to, these girls were able to go and get married to a different shevet, Loi Tov Yoisa Adam Levadai, Matzah Isha Matzah Tov. So that's why it's a Yom Tov. And it's very interesting, that's how he explains Tosfos. Tosfos says, Yom Shehutu Shvatim Lavi Zeh B'Zeh, Pirush, says Tosfos, Dahainu Yom Tov. What is Tosfos saying? Pirush Dahainu Yom Tov. What does that mean, Dahainu Yom Tov? It's a Yom Tov because they were able to get married into other Shvatim. So that's reason number one. Tu BeAv today is a Yom Tov. Reason number one in the Gemara, it's a Yom Tov. Shehutu Shvatim Lavi Zeh B'Zeh. They were able to, the girls that got Nachla, they got Nachla from their parents, and if they would marry a different Shevet, the Nachla would move over, they're allowed to marry a different Shevet.
Even in that time, any daughter could get married to another Shevet, or it was just after those ones?
It was just the ones that the Shevet would go over, right, the Yerusha would go over, they were not allowed at that door, and then afterwards they were allowed to.
If a girl had brothers in that time, she could have married.
Yes, because then the Yerusha would have gone to the sons, and Mela wouldn't change over to Nachla, to a different Shevet. The next reason that we're going to speak about, which is reason number 3 in the Gemara says, the reason why it's a Yom Tov, says the Gemara, Yom Shekolu Meisei Midbar. Meaning to say, Rashi explains, Rashi explains, every year, Erev Tisha B'Av, a Baskel went out and said to all of Klal Yisrael, from the ones that were from 20 to 60, and the Dora Midbar from the Chet Meraglim, that they should dig a grave, a caver, and they should go into the caver. And they went in, and the next morning, another Baskel said, Yibodlu Achayim and Amesim, the ones that are still alive should come out of that caver. And that happened for 40 years. Every year, Tisha B'Av, that's what happened. So, then came Tisha B'Av of the last year of the 40 years, they went in, and the Gzeira stopped, and everybody came out. So everybody came out, that's called Umeisei Amidbar. We're not done yet what the reason of the Yom Tov is, even though this itself technically could be a Yom Tov, that they stopped now. But really they technically stopped on Tisha B'Av already, but we'll get to that in a minute. So what happened? Why is it Tu BeAv? The Yom Tov should be on Tisha B'Av. The teretz is they weren't sure when they came out Tisha B'Av in the morning. They thought could be they made a mistake. They're off with the calendar, and it's really not Tisha B'Av. So they went back in Yurav. Could you imagine? And they all came out again. Yud Aleph, they went in and they came out again. Till it came to Tes Vav Av. Why didn't they think they're still making a mistake? Because they saw the moon was full. So it's for sure not Tisha B'Av. Up until it's full, it could be they're not sure exactly how full or not full. Once the moon was full at Tes Vav Av in the middle of the month, so they knew that it's for sure not Tisha B'Av anymore. And if they all stayed alive, that's an unbelievable happiness. The Gzeira is over.
Still the Yom Shekalu, it's the Yom they chapped.
Right.
It's Simcha they chapped, but it's not the day that stops still.
Good, and we'll soon see that it's really not even this. It's really something else. But technically, you're right. If technically it's when they chapped. Yeah, very good. Good point. Very good point. It's when they chapped. The Ben Yoyada brings from the Gvuras Ariz, the Shagas Arya, and he says, how could it be Moshe Rabbeinu, Klal Yisrael, they made a mistake for so many days, they weren't sure? It's clear, whenever the calendar, Kiddush Al Pi Ariyah, how could you make a mistake? What was the, you have a good point, you're saying that it's interesting that there was a mistake and it's only what they chapped. Good, so you're right, the happiness is on when they chapped at a Tes Vav Vav. But how could have they made such a mistake? How do you understand such a mistake? So he explains that the Eibishter made that Klal Yisrael should make such a mistake. And the reason for that is because the Gemara in Taina says, Megalgalan schus liyoim zakai, umegalgalan choiv liyoim chayiv. And the Gemara explains actually, what does it mean liyoim chayiv? The Gemara says, the first Churban Bais Hamikdash was on Tisha B'Av. And that we have Mefurish Psukim, in Malachim, Perek Chaf Hei Pasuk Ches, and in Yirmiyah, Mefurish. So the Gemara says, and Churban Beis Hamikdash, the second Churban also happened on Tisha B'Av. Many things, bad things happen on Tisha B'Av because it's a Yom Chayiv. The Gemara actually doesn't say what's the Yom Zakai. Says the Ben Yoyada, the Yom Zakai is Tes Vav Av. As we're going to see now, Behemshech of today's Shiur, different reasons for what was a day of Simcha. So the Eibishter made that they should make a mistake and not be clear, like you pointed out. It's very interesting. It's all because of the mistake, but they should make a mistake, and the happiness kicked in on Tes Vav Av. Because it's a day that many other happy things happened throughout the Doros. So really, we could stop right here. The happiness is taka that they stop dying. But the Gemara continues, and the Gemara says, right after this, before going to the next reason, the Gemara says that the day that this started, the Chet HaMeraglim, and every Tes Vav, they went in and they died, there was a big Avelis, there was a sadness, there was a Atzvus. Ve'ein hashchina shoyra, says Taisvis, elamatoich simcha. Therefore, how the Gemara says, Rashi explains, throughout the 40 years in the Midbar, the Shechina Akdosha, the Eibusha, did not speak to Moshe Rabbeinu. Actually, Kolu Meisei Midbar, till after the 40 years at the Meisei Midbar, they didn't die. Loihoyu Dibur and Moshe. There was no Dibur talking of the Rabbeinu Shalom and Moshe. Now, what does it mean there wasn't a Dibur? There was no talking. Of course, the reason is because there was an Atzvus, because the Klal Yisrael was in 40 years of Gzeira, of dying. But what do you mean there was no talking? If you look after Parsha Shlach, after the Meraglim, the next Parsha in Koirach, Vaydabar Hashem al Moshe Lei, Vaydabar Hashem, the Eibusha spoke to Moshe Rabbeinu. What does it mean he didn't speak? There was no Nevi'us to Moshe Rabbeinu. So the Rashbam in Bab Basra, Kuf Chaf Aleph on the basis, the same Gemara as the Gemara was saying now, that it was only Kefit Tzorech Hasha. Yes, the Eibusha spoke to Moshe Rabbeinu, but only the absolute necessary. Anything else that was not necessary, Moshe Rabbeinu did not get any nevias from the Eibishter. That's how the Rashbam explains. Rashi by us says, yes, that the Eibishter spoke to Moshe Rabbeinu, but not peh peh. In other words, Moshe Rabbeinu was on the highest level, that it was crystal clear the nevias that he got from Moshe Rabbeinu. In the 40 years of the Nevi'as, Rashi explains by Asam Sechtes Tainis, it was Bechazoyin Laila, it was unclear, it was Gimgum. It wasn't clear. The Ben Yoyada says, Va'no Avda Nirali, saying on himself, Ami the Eved Nirali, he says a different shot, And he says like this, that when the Eibishter spoke to Moshe Rabbeinu, as it says, Shechina midaberes matoich groinoi. The Shechina spoke from Moshe Rabbeinu's throat. Shechina midaberes matoich groinoi. Which comes out something very powerful. That Klal Yisrael, when they heard Moshe Rabbeinu saying halachas, saying over the Torah, they actually heard the Eibishter speaking. Shechina medaberes matoich groinoi. Says the Ben Yehoyada, for the 40 years in the Midbar, Klal Yisrael heard, but it wasn't Shechina medaberes matoich groinoi. They got the messages from the Rabbi Shalom, but they didn't hear it, the Shechina medaberes matoich groinoi. So all this, the bottom line is that the 40 years in the Midbar, being that Klal Yisrael was dying, and there was an Avelis, there was an Atzvus, there was no Shechina direct talking to Moshe Rabbeinu to Klal Yisrael, and that stopped now. And that's why it was a Yom Tov. It stopped Tes BeAv. So Rashi says there was a mistake, they weren't sure, and they waited till Tes Vav. Which he's not asking good. You bothered that Lamaisa, the mistake, and we saw over that the mistake was Badafka, that it should fall out on Tes Vav Av. Tosfos actually, Malbasa says a different reason. How do you get to the Cheshbon of Tes Vav Av? Tosfos says that Tes Vav Av is after the days of Avelis. In other words, they every year they died. But then there was Avelis, there was the days of Avelis. The days of Avelis lasted till Tes Vav Av. Yeah. Which I'm just thinking now, as I'm saying it over to the Olam, it's interesting, because really it says that last year nobody died. So I'm not sure why there was a Shiva that year. I'm not sure if I have to be ma'ayin more. But Tosfos says clearly, Tosfos and Baal Basra, that really it was already Tes. They could have been happy Tes, but then there was the Shiva till Tes Vav Av. Which again, it's interesting, because if no one died, there was no Shiva. Rabbi Chanan asks a different question. Rabbi Chanan and Baal Basra and Kovet Shurim asks, like you pointed out very good, Shiva. The whole Shiva is only the Rabbanan. So what are you telling me? In the Midbar, the Dur of Kabbalah Satorah, you know why the Avelis and the sadness continued till Tes Vav, and that's why the Shechina only started speaking again to Klal Yisrael after Tes Vav, because of the Shiva. Asks Rabbi Chanan, Shiva's only midrabanan. So they were noyeg in the Midbar, the din derabanan of Shiva. The first day on Ninas is midiraisa, but the Shiva's only derabanan. Interesting on this question, if you take a look at the Rambam in the beginning of Hilchas Avelis, the Lashon Rambam, and the Rambam speaks about what's the Raisa, mitzvahs aseilis abel ala kroivim, it's min ha-Torah, but like the Rambam says, elo b'yoim rishon bulvad is min ha-Torah, shu yoim ha-misav ha-kfura, but it's only the first day. Continues the Rambam, avol shar hashiva eina din Torah, like we just said, it's taka, it's not min ha-Torah. But the Rambam continues, avol shivas yomim, you know when it is? Nitna Torah v'neschach halacha, when? Moshe Rabbeinu tikun lahem liyisrael. Moshe Rabbeinu was masakin Shiva. So if Moshe Rabbeinu was masakin, it wasn't a later time, the Rabbanon, let's say Anshe Knesset Agdol in the time of Bais Sheni. Shiva, which is the Rabbanon, but it's the time of Moshe Rabbeinu. So that would be pshat in Tosfos. Rabbi Chanan asks, Shiva's only the Rabbanon. So what does it mean we're waiting till Tu BeAv? It's the Rabbanon. It's taka the Rabbanon. But which Rabbanon machadish the din Shiva? Moshe Rabbeinu. So that's why in the third reason, but the second reason we're speaking about why it's a Yom Tov is because the Avelis and the sadness in Klal Yisrael stopped today, Tu BeAv. And the Mele, we will zeicha again for Hashras Hashchina in the sense of the Eibush, the Rabbi Shalom, speaking clearly to Moshe Rabbeinu. We were able to hear what the Eibush was telling Moshe Rabbeinu. Just to go back, we mentioned in the first reason the Bnei Yissaschar why it's a Yom Tov. We said it's a Yom Tov, just like we said Tov L'Hodeis L'Hashem. So here also he explains the reason why it's a Yom. What's the Yom Tov? The pasuk says by Moshe Rabbeinu, and the Medrash explains the pasuk Vatera Oisa Ki TOV. So the Medrash says, what's TOV? Right, opened up the box Moshe Rabbeinu Ki TOV. What's TOV? So the Medrash says the Nevi'us, because Moshe Rabbeinu was going to become a Navi. The Nevi'us is TOV. So says the Bnei Yissaschar, you know why today is a Yom Tov, a Yom of TOV? Because Nevi'us, Vatera Oisa Ki TOV, Yom Tov, to Yom Tov are for a Nevi'us.
Where's it? Vatera Oisa Ki TOV?
In the Psuk in Parasha Shemois Ve'era by Moshe Rabbeinu when he was born, and they hid him, and then they opened up the box and they saw Ki TOV. So the Medrash says, what was the TOV that they saw in him? They saw the TOV, this that he's going to be a Navi. Another reason, and this is the sixth reason, so for today's shir maybe a balein or a different Tu BeAv will say on the other three reasons, but for now we're going to say three reasons. Another reason, which is the final reason in the Gemara says that today Tu BeAv, they stopped cutting wood for the Mizbeach, for the Bais Medrash. Why did they stop today? So the Gemara explains, and Rashi is mayrich a little bit more. The Gemara says that after Tu BeAv, the sun starts getting schwacher. It's not as hot. And the reason for that is because the days now are starting to get shorter. Right? Shkia is moving earlier and earlier. As a matter of fact, we had some real hot days, but now it's nice weather. It's somewhat cooling down. But the Gemara says that the sun is not as powerful. Being so that it's not as powerful, it doesn't dry out the wood properly. And how Rashi brings from the Mishnah Midas Perek Beis that wood that had worms is possible mizbeach. So when they cut down the wood, it needed to dry out into the sense that no bugs are going to be there, come there. If it's damp, the wood, that attracts worms. So it had to be dried out. They were only able to dry out the wood up until Tu BeAv. So that's why, so they stopped. So before going in what the Yom Tov is, Rabbi Chanan asks, wait a second. When does the sun start to get schwacher, not as powerful? Tu BeAv. Asks Rabbi Chanan, really, it's not dependent on the Hebrew calendar. Just like when do we start saying the Saint Talamater? That has to do with the rain. So we don't start at a certain Hebrew date. We start December 5th. So here also it should be the date. What'd you say?
It gets shorter after the summer solstice.
Yeah. Right. That's when it gets shorter, but not Tu BeAv. Right. When is it exactly? It's something like maybe July 21st is the longest day. And at some point within this now, we're in that kufa, but it's nothing to do with Tu BeAv. It has to do with the English date. So why is it Tu BeAv the day that they stopped cutting the wood? That's Rabbi Chanan's kasha. And he bleibt schwer. He says, why Tu BeAv? The Kedushas Levi explains, he doesn't ask this particular question, but he answers this question. He asks a different question. The Mishnah says, "Le'hoyu yomim tovim liYisrael." Le'hoyu yomim tovim liYisrael. To Klal Yisrael, any Yom Tov is to Klal Yisrael. What does it mean? Le'hoyu yomim tovim liYisrael. Versteht sich? It's Klal Yisrael. What are we talking about? For the Goyim? So he explains, and he says like this. Really, the Goyim, their koyach is the sun, and Klal Yisrael's koyach is the Levana. Now that Tosh Koycha Shal Chama, which is really a Likui Chama, which is not a good simon for the Goyim, but as a matter of fact, today Tu BeAv, where the moon is full, the Chidush Al Levana, that's the koyach of Klal Yisrael. So it's true, Rabbi Chanan asked, wait a second, the Tosh Koycha Shal Chama is not exactly Tu BeAv. But what we're celebrating over here is actually this, that it's Tosh Koycha Shal Chama, which is actually, you're right, with the calendar that's based off the sun. But at the same time, for us, it's the Milui Alavana, which is actually the Koyach of Klal Yisrael. So that's the Yom Tov. We're going to explain a little more about this also in a little bit. but this would be the Yom Tov. This for itself is the Yom Tov. The Yom Tov is that it's Tosh Koicha Shal Chama, the Koich of the Goyim, and Fakert, the Koich of Klal Yisrael. We have the moon, B'Maloya, today it's a full moon. But let's go back, even though we said now one reason why stopping to cut the wood is a Yom Tov, because from the Kedushas Levi, but let's go back. The reason I brought it in now, even though I'm going to be a little more ma'arich about it soon, because the Rabbi Chanan's Kasha, this answers Rabbi Chanan's Kasha. Going back to what the Yom Tov is, the Rashbam explains that the Yom Tov is, you know what the Yom Tov is? Siyuma shal mitzvah. Whenever you finish a mitzvah, you make a siyum, and it's a zman simcha. The Lashon Rashbam, v'oisa yoim shepasku hayu smeichim, they were happy, sheba'oisa yoim hashlim mitzvah gedolah kazais. In Yeridea, I think it's Hilchos Talmud Torah, Siman Reish Mem Vav, in Siv Chavav, the Ramah says that we're noyagim to make a siyum when you finish a Masechta. Yeah, I think we know this halacha very well, especially now coming off the 9 days, but you make a siyum. The Ramah says you make a siyum. Says the Goyin over there, what's the Makoyer that you make a siyum? What's the Makoyer? Of course, you say Hadran, you make a Suda. What's the Makoyer? Says the Goyin, the Makoyer is our Gemara. Just like Tu BeAv is a Yom Simcha because we were zoichet to finish the mitzvah, says the Goyin, anytime you finish a Masechta, it's the same idea because we're zoichet, also Siyuma Shal Mitzvah. We find the same thing also in Hilchas Sukkah, Simchas Torah, Siman Tafresh Samach Tes Sif Aleph. The Shulchan Aruch says that what's Simchas Torah? Simchas Torah is the Siyum, Simcha L'Goyim Shal Torah, and you make a Suda. And the Mishra brings also Medrash Shira Shirim. For every siyum of a mitzvah or of a Torah, of a Masechta, you make a Suda. So come to Chais, what was the Simcha? The Simcha is that they finished the mitzvah. That's today.
The was cutting the wood from the mitzvah, that was the mitzvah? Oh.
Yes. Just to jump back to what I said from the Kedushas Levi, I wanted to really, because there are shvamas from the Rishonim, but we said from the Kedushas Levi that today, starting Tu BeAv, is the Levanas is in its full stage, as opposed to the Chamas getting shvacher. So even though the Goyim go, their koyach is from the Chama, it's getting shvacher. In Meiser Rekeach, he's from Amsterdam, he's the Rekeach, the Belzer Rebbe's, he's their grandfather, and he says the same idea, but he says even a little more. He says that Tammuz and Av is the koyach of Esav. The months of the year, that's their koyach. And now also, even though Av is their koyach, it comes now that the sun starts getting shvach, is Tosh Koyach Shal Chama. The Kedushas Levi says, a different piece of Kedushas Levi says that Av has two parts to it. We know the beginning of Av, Mishenichnas Av, Memat and Besimcha. It's sad. But then comes after Tisha B'Av, there's a transition. Spoke about it, between Tisha B'Av and Nachum. I gave a separate discussion. But says the Kedushas Levi, where does the transition come about? Tesvav Av. Av is Aleph Beis, Orur and Baruch. Up until Tesvav Av, it's still the sad days. From today going forward is the happy days, is the Baruch. The Gemara's Mamshach, the Gemara says, after saying that we stopped cutting the wood because the sun is shvacher, because the sun goes down earlier, the Gemara says, Omer Rebbe Nashi, I think it's a pretty famous Gemara, the Kori le Yom Tager Magal, means you put away the suah to cut down, the magal to cut down the tree. And then the Gemara says, Makan ve'elech, the Moisef Yosef. In other words, the Gemara is saying that a person has to buckle down to learn more. What does it mean to learn more? You learn as much as you can learn. But being that it's starting to get dark, and you're not going to be able to kind of learn because it's dark. So a person, let's say, learns, he works to whatever time, and then he learns. But now that it's dark, so he's not going to learn. So a person has to make sure, even though it gets dark, like the Lashon HaRashbam, that you're supposed to learn even by night. Now that, so to speak, the winter is starting, the nights are getting longer. So don't not learn. You might not learn because it's dark. You have to continue to learn. To be mechazek. Rabbeinu Gershom says, Mo'er HaGoyla, that this is the Yom Tov. The Yom Tov is that because we stopped cutting the wood, now we could learn more. But before Rabbeinu Gershom, when the Gemara says to learn more, the Gemara is saying is that because it's starting to, we just said now that the sun goes down earlier, so it's dark, so technically you would learn less. Make sure not to learn less. That's the pashtus in the Gemara. But Rabbeinu Gershon explains the Yom Tov was that we have more time to learn. This concept that not to learn less because it gets dark earlier really is less relevant bismanedu. Why is it less relevant bismanedu? Because anyways, people learn when it's dark, when it's light. You have electric, you have steam, you have heat. There's nothing. You have air conditioning. It has nothing to do with the light and the dark. Though in Darkei Chaim V'Shalom, the Minkasha says that starting from now, TOV Av is 45 days to Rosh Hashanah. And just like it's Mavur in Yeridea and Halacha, that 45 days is a year in regard to Arla. The first 3 years is Arla. What's if you plant a tree 45 days before Rosh Hashanah? It's considered a year. Why is it considered a year? Because it takes 45 days to be koilet, to get attached into the ground. It takes 45 days for us to anchor ourselves to prepare for Rosh Hashanah. So starting today is already a day to start preparing ourselves to connect more in Torah and Tefillah. They bring over there that his minig was from today ready to wish a ksiva chasima toiva. So we spoke today 3 reasons out of the 6 why today is a Yom Tov. One is shehutru ashvatim, to get married. If it was only ladies and they got a nachla, they can marry to other shvatim. We said the second reason, shekolu meisei amidbar, and the Shechina midaberes. We started, the Shechina came back, the Nevi'as. And we said a third reason, the Gemara says that they were goymer the mitzvah of cutting the wood. And part of that is that Rabbeinu Gershon says to be able to learn more. Just to conclude, the Gemara right afterwards, the Gemara says, Omer Rebbe Elazar, Asad HaKadosh Baruch Hu lasses machal tzadikim. The Eibush is going to make a circle, and the circle is going to be around the Shechina Kaviyachol. V'chol echad marabet spoi ze Hashem. Explains the Bnei Yissaschar from the Oyev Yisrael. Rabbi Leibel Eger, who is the grandson of Reb Kiva, says that he heard from his grandfather Reb Kiva, B'Shem his grandfather. And the Chafetz Chaim says this as well also. What's the idea of Asad HaKadosh Baruch Hu to make a circle? So he says, when people sit, these VIP seats, you have closer seats to the front, then these further back, more expensive, cheaper seats. When there's a circle, an even circle, and then let's say there's the middle, everybody is the same far from the middle. So they explain, different tzaddikim have different avodas. But if everybody's goal is to connect to the Rabbeinu Shalom, it's all the same, it's all even. La'asad Lavo, Mashiach's going to come. There's not going to be any Asad HaKadosh Baruch Hu lasses machal, a circle, and everyone's going to sit even exactly. Any tzaddik that meant l'shem shamayim, to get closer to Hashem, would be even to the middle, to the Rabbeinu Shalom, to the circle. That's the Gemara, that's it explained the Gemara. This piece, the Bnei Yissaschar, extends to Tu BeAv, and he says like this. First of all, what's going to be? It's going to be a Yom Tov la'asad lavai. Why a Yom Tov? Because if there's no kinna, there's no sinner, that's a Yom Tov. And he says that's the words Tu BeAv. Tes Vav, letter Tes Vav, Ba'av, and the Aleph Beis What's the letter Tezvav? The 15th letter is Samach. Samach and the Aleph base is a circle. La'asad Lavoid, there's going to be no sin and no kin. Everybody's going to realize we're all working for the same Rebbeinu Shalom to get close. Mochoy la tzadikim. That's going to be the ultimate Yom Tov that we should be zoicha. So we have now Tu BeAv, but when the Gemara concludes Asra Kadosh Baruch Hu, we want to be zoicha to the Yom Tov, YOM shekulei TOV, to be zoicha to this, that there's going to be a mochel at tzadikim, we're all going to be in the Nehenim as if Shechina. Have a wonderful day.
Wow.